The combustion process gets this piston going up and down, and it's the job of the crankshaft to turn that up and down motion into rotation. And that rotation comes off the crankshaft at this end, connects to the flywheel, and is carried to the vehicle wheels. This is one of those things that's really bad for the engine that we do in this video series. Running a crankshaft around dry with no lubrication on the bearings, that's particularly bad. The crankshaft's usually made of cast iron or forged steel. If you're not sure which, then you can take a look at this parting line. If it's thin, then that will be a cast crankshaft where the two molds come together and then released. You leave a thin ridge around this midpoint of the crankshaft. For a forged crankshaft, that's going to be a lot wider. Let's talk about the parts of the crankshaft quickly before we pop it into the engine block. So the crankshaft rotates around the main journals. A journal is the inner part of a bearing, so it's the shaft that rotates inside a bearing. And we've got two types of journals on this crankshaft. We've got the main journals, or just the mains, which are the parts that fit clamped inside the crankcase, and those are what the crankshaft rotates around. And then in between the mains, so we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 mains, and then in between those we have 1, 2, 3, 4 rod journals. And the rod journals are offset from the mains, and they are what fit through the big end, which is this end, of the connecting rod. So the connecting rod sits on the rod journal, and as the crankshaft rotates, it moves around at an offset and generates our up and down movement. The rod journals have a few different names. They're also called the crank pins, the big end journals, or just the pins. We'll stick to rod journals in this video series. The parts that join the rod journals and the mains are the webs, which are these parts here. And on the end of the webs, generally, you'll find a counterweight, which is designed to offset the weight of the piston. We'll talk about all this more later. Let's talk a little bit about some crucial engine geometry. So the center line of the crankshaft runs along here, along the center of these main journals, and that's where the crankshaft rotates around, centered on those main journals. The rod journals are offset by a certain distance from the center line of these main journals. So from there, from the center line here, up to the center of this rod journal, this is known as the crank radius. So, as we turn this around, we can see at the bottom dead center of the stroke, the crank radius, let's call it 4 centimeters for the sake of maths here. We're 4 centimeters below the center line of the crankshaft, and at top dead center, at the top of the stroke, we're 4 centimeters above. So the stroke of the engine, that is the distance that this piston travels from the bottom to the top, is twice the crank radius. That can be seen here. So we move up, and we've gone up 1 crank radius. Now we've gone up 2 crank radiuses. So 2 crank radiuses is the stroke of the engine. The distance that the piston travels up and down the cylinder is known as the stroke, and that determines the engine capacity to a large degree, including with the cross-sectional area of the cylinder. That tells us the displacement of this engine. We've got counterweights on this crankshaft. So opposite to the rod journal, we have some elongated areas of the web, these two parts here. These are counterweights. These are designed to offset the weight of the piston assembly. This is the piston assembly, being the piston and the connecting rod. And what happens is, as this engine is spinning around, as the crankshaft is spinning around, the piston is moving up and down, and that creates a momentum top and bottom of this as we've got changes in direction. And the idea of the counterweight is to offset that movement. So as the piston moves up, we have an upward motion of the weight. At the same time, we have a downward motion of the counterweight. So as the piston moves up, counterweight moves down. As the piston moves down, the counterweight moves up. That reduces the vibration of the engine, creates a smoother running system, and that enables higher RPM. So well-balanced crankshaft is important. And what happens at the factory is this will be balanced as it comes off the production line. The flywheel will be attached at this end, the pulley will be attached at this end, and then it's run on a machine that determines where it's out of balance, and then bits of metal are removed from these counterweights to create the exact mass that's needed to counteract this piston assembly. So these holes here are balance holes, and where weight needs to be added In some cases, you'll find that they insert a heavy metal into these holes to add additional weight to that side of the crankshaft. So that's crankshaft balancing. We'll talk more about crankshaft balancing in a video all about engine balance. I've just loosely installed the crankshaft here in the engine block so we can see how this mounts. And what we've got is a main saddle here, which is milled into the engine block. On top of that saddle is a bearing insert, which I hope you can see there. Then we have the crankshaft. Then on top of the crankshaft is another bearing shell that sits inside this, which is the main cap. And that main cap goes on the top there, and we have two bolts, or you may have studs, which clamp that down with a very well specified torque. So the thing to note is that these main caps belong to each of the saddles. So if you have 5, they need to go back in the correct order. They're generally numbered, but if they weren't, you'd want to number them so that you can pair them up later. I'm going to take out the crankshaft so we can see this assembly in a little bit more detail. With the crankshaft out, we can see now in more detail what's going on here. The dimensions on these fittings are absolutely vital. These are real tight clearances that we've got going on here. So the diameter of this bore needs to be precise. It also needs to be precisely round. Likewise, the journal of the crankshaft also needs to be perfectly round and exactly dimensioned, so that we've got a precise clearance here that's created by these bearing inserts. When the engine's made, all 5 of these bearing caps are installed and tightened down, torqued down, and then these holes are bored all the way through, which creates the holes in a perfect line. And that's why you need to keep them matched, so that the first bearing cap goes on here, the second on there, and so on, so that they're precisely dimensioned. I'm just going to take off this cap and we'll have a look at the bearing in more detail. I'll just pop out this bearing insert so we can have a closer look. The bearing itself is made of softer metal than the journal, which means if there's any metal to metal contact, the bearing takes the wear and not the crankshaft journal. And we can see we've got a hole in the bearing here and a matching hole in the saddle. And through this hole comes oil under pressure from inside the block. The clearance between this bearing insert and the crankshaft journal is what creates the oil pressure, or mostly what creates the oil pressure inside this engine. And that oil pressure is needed to create this film of oil to just slightly separate the journal from the bearing so that we've got no contact between the two. And that minimizes friction. The other thing on this bearing that we've got is a locating tab, and that locating tab fits inside a matching notch on the saddle here, as you can see, in order to locate that perfectly. And the other thing is a groove. What you can see is a groove in this, and if we look at the top shell, this is a matched pair. This one goes on the bottom, this one goes on the top, and the top doesn't have a groove, as we see here. And that groove is there to allow oil to enter into the crankshaft and then run through a passageway in the crankshaft up to the rod journal, where it then lubricates that other bearing. We'll see that shortly. But that's why we have a groove on this one. And just like the main bearings, the rod bearings or the rod journals run on a film of oil. So between the bearings, which are inside the big end of this piston, we have a bearing shell in here and a matching bearing shell on the other side. We want this to run on a film of oil. And that oil comes through a oil passageway, an oil way, which is drilled in the crankshaft. So in the end of the crankshaft here, in the web of the crankshaft, we have a hole drilled, and there's a hole that runs all the way through here, through this rod journal, through this web at an angle, up here to the main journal. And you can see in the main journal here, there are 2 holes drilled. We can show one at a time. The reason there's 2 is so that there's always a hole in contact with the reservoir of oil that runs inside this bearing here in the groove. And so the oil makes its way in through this hole, into the crankshaft, along this angled passageway, up here to the rod journal, where we also have 2 holes. And the oil comes out through those holes, lubricates the inside of this bearing shell, and ensures that this is running on a film of oil. And once that oil is past the bearing, it then is sprayed around, or it just escapes from this bearing and is flung around inside the crankcase, lubricating various surfaces, the underside of the pistons and so on. So that's the way that this bearing is lubricated. It's quite ingenious. when the crankshaft is cast in the factory, these holes are drilled all the way through and then plugged to seal them. I'm just popping these bearings back in, and then we'll put in the crankshaft, and we can see why we need thrust washers. So with the crankshaft in there, the crankshaft can move back and forth or lengthways along, and as you can hear and you can see, we've got some movement there on the crankshaft itself, which is certainly something that we don't want. So the job of the thrust washers is to stop this back and forth or forwards and backwards motion of the crankshaft by taking up that clearance. If we take this out, now you can see with two thrust washers, these fit here on the fourth saddle. We have a space for two thrust washers which are precisely specified thickness and should take out the end play in that crankshaft. So as we fit these in here, you can get different dimensions of these. If we reinstall the crankshaft into there, and now if we try and slide that back and forth, we have minimal end play, which is specified in the service manual. So if you're not sure how much end play there should be in a vehicle, then check the service manual and that's going to tell you. Having taken this thing to pieces and put it back together again and taken it to pieces, we'll install these properly. So I'll install these main bearing shells, and then I will use some assembly lube just to lubricate those, and then we'll install the crankshaft. This is assembly lube. It's thicker than a normal engine oil. It hangs around in the engine more. So you would use this when you're building an engine. If it's not going to run up to speed and you're not going to get oil around these parts relatively soon, then this is a thicker substance which will stick and not just dissipate like normal engine oil. The reason I like this one is it's red, so you can see easily which parts you've lubricated, and it just looks cool. As we're installing these main caps, I'll just apply a bit of oil to the thread on these bolts. That's good to do anytime that you're torquing something down to a specific torque. Make sure that we're not fighting friction on the threads. With the bolts in just loose, I'm just going to tighten these down until they make contact. I've installed the crankshaft and the main caps on top, and then finger tightened the bolts on here, just snug them down until they're flush with the surface. So what you'll find is that any bolt that has an important role to play, a structural requirement, will often have a torque setting that's specified in the workshop manual or the manufacturer's details. And that means basically how tight that bolt needs to be. It's a way of specifying the tension in the bolt. We want to tighten these bolts down in 3 stages. One low torque, one medium, and finally we'll end up at 55 Newton meters. So we'll do that now. If you want to know how to use a torque wrench, check out the video on using a torque wrench. The other important thing to say on this crankshaft is that generally bolts want to be tightened down in a pattern to prevent too much strain on the part. So in our case, we're going to work in a spiral direction, starting in the middle and moving 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. We've got the crankshaft installed and clamped down around the main journals. What can go wrong with a crankshaft? Well, not a great deal because they're pretty sturdy and reliable, but they do wear over time. What can happen is the journals will wear, either become out of size or no longer round, out of round. The dimensions for this, the diameter for a journal will be specified by the manufacturer in the workshop manual, and particularly low oil pressure is what's going to cause this wear. So if there's low oil pressure, there's metal to metal contact, the journal will wear, and then the crankshaft will need to be reground, which is where metal is removed, just a thin layer of metal is removed to make these journals round again. Once that's done, you need to install oversized bearings. The other thing that can happen to a crankshaft, which is fatal, is fatigue, which is generally going to occur here on these joints, these fillets between the webs and the journals themselves, and those want a perfectly round radius in there. You need to be looked very carefully to see there, but that's a weak point on these. So fatigue from the constant torsion on a crankshaft can cause it to crack and break on one of these, a broken crankshaft. Highly unlikely to happen in anything but racing, really. So upgrading a crankshaft, well, you could install a stronger crankshaft. So if you were boosting an engine, or if you were looking to get more power out of an engine, you might want to add a stronger crankshaft. This one is cast iron. A forged crankshaft would be stronger, and a billet crankshaft would be stronger still. The other thing that people do is you can get what's called a stroker crankshaft, which is a crankshaft with a longer crank radius, and that means that the stroke of the piston is increased and we have a bigger cylinder capacity. So that's a way to increase the capacity, the displacement of an engine, is through the use of a stroker crankshaft. That comes as a kit because as the stroke is increased, the piston travels further up, and without a shorter connecting rod, then the piston would hit the roof of the cylinder. So this generally comes as a kit. You get a stroker crankshaft, you get shorter connecting rods, probably new pistons at the same time. It's pretty expensive for a Miata. It's around $5,000 for a stroker crankshaft, so that's significant money for a slightly greater engine displacement. Those are really the only two things that would happen to a crankshaft.